The next part of my talk is going to be about the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. Now, where the ADA is different from other employment laws like race discrimination laws and sex discrimination laws is that the ADA imposes an affirmative duty on employers. With race and sex discrimination, essentially you have to refrain from engaging in discriminatory conduct. With the ADA, you have to refrain from discriminatory conduct as well, but you also have an affirmative duty to accommodate disabled employees as well as potential employees who are disabled. I'm going to go through 3 general rules here. The first 2 are very similar to what you would find for race and sex discrimination. The third one is different. The first general rule is you may not take an adverse employment action against an employee because of a disability, nor may you deny a potential employee a job opportunity because of their disability. Secondly, for existing employees, you may not harass them on the basis of their disability. Now, under the ADA, disability is defined pretty broadly, and the definition was actually broadened significantly 13 years ago. For our purposes, we're going to keep it simple and assume that the person who is disabled is paralyzed and in a wheelchair. So no question that he or she would fall under the category of disabled. The third general rule, and this is really, in my estimation, the most important rule for ADA claims to remember, is that employers are required to make a reasonable accommodation for their employees' disability. If you remember nothing else from this portion of the talk, I want you to remember 4 words. The first 2 words I want you to remember is reasonable accommodation. Those are words that you need to remember. They're part of this third general rule, and you need to commit them to memory. Right? And secondly, you need to remember these other 2 words, interactive process. Okay? If you don't engage in the interactive process, you may not be considered to have engaged or to have provided a reasonable accommodation. We're going to go through some examples so that you can understand better what I mean by these terms, reasonable accommodation and interactive process. The first hypothetical is Stan Sellers is in a wheelchair. He applies for a job with Acme as an outdoor salesperson. Acme provides outdoor salespeople with company cars so that they can meet with potential clients. In the case of Sellers, they would have to purchase a special car to accommodate his paralysis, and it will cost $100,000 to buy that car. And for that same amount of money, they could hire 2 additional outdoor salespeople. Because of that, Acme chooses to hire an able-bodied African American and they do not hire Sellers. The question is, does Sellers have a strong claim for disability discrimination against Acme? The answer is, maybe somewhat surprisingly, is no, he does not. Remember when I said a few seconds ago, reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodation is not the same thing as accommodation at any cost. That's very important to bear in mind, probably more important to bear in mind if you're a plaintiff than as a company. But the bottom line is a company is not required to bankrupt itself or to put itself in financial jeopardy to accommodate the disabled. It has to be a reasonable accommodation. In this hypothetical, I think the average person would say it's not reasonable to expect the company to pay $100,000 when they could hire 2 new employees rather than make that accommodation. Does the answer change? If the Acme can get an accommodation with a car for $10,000, I think it clearly does. That's a much lower amount of money. You can't hire even 1 new employee, outdoor salesperson with $10,000. Depending on Acme's revenue, I think probably that would be a reasonable accommodation. And if you change it up again, make it $50,000. Now you're in a gray area, which unfortunately is probably what you're going to see. But the main takeaway is you want to make sure that you offer a reasonable accommodation. In this hypothetical, Acme did that. The only reasonable accommodation they could find, regrettably, was a $100,000 car. Under that, unfortunately, I think Stan does not have a claim and Acme is fine. Second hypothetical, Frankie Frisch, he's an outdoor salesperson. He has recently developed a rare condition that makes it very painful for him to wear shoes. Okay? And when he wears shoes and he walks for 5 minutes in those shoes, he has excruciating pain. Acme's policy for its outdoor salespeople is that they must wear dress shoes when meeting with potential clients. Supervisor Killjoy says, "I'm sorry, Frankie, you're a great salesperson, can't have you meeting with people in bare feet, you're terminated. Question here is, does Frisch have a strong legal claim for disability discrimination against Acme? And the answer here is absolutely yes. Remember, I said 4 words. Let's talk now about what happened here. There was no attempt to make a reasonable accommodation. Okay? The way you make a reasonable accommodation, or at least try to, is by engaging the interactive process, which very simply put is the employer-employee getting together and communicating about possible accommodations that can be made. Now, you can engage as a company in an interactive process with the employee, and it may be impossible to find the reasonable accommodation. But if you don't make the try, if you don't engage in the interactive process, there are courts who will say just on that basis alone, you are guilty of violating the ADA. So as employers, you have to keep in mind that you have to try to accommodate a disability. You have to engage in the interactive process. It may not be possible to make a reasonable accommodation, but if you don't even try, you're going to expose yourself to disability discrimination lawsuits.